Hi everybody, my name is Jo Kemp and I'm one of the senior editors of BJSM. And what this video will hopefully do is help you develop an outstanding application for a BJSM Global Research Grant. So the BJSM Global Research Grant Scheme was developed because we recognise that support for research is not equal globally, and that this particularly creates a barrier to publishing in top journals for some researchers at all stages of the sport and exercise medicine research process. So, for example, either designing studies, in the analysis, the writing, and gaining funding. And this perpetuates inequity. There are also many important questions in sport and exercise medicine that can only be answered through research that's conducted by diverse teams. So this initiative aims to provide funding opportunities for sport and exercise medicine researchers from marginalised groups to conduct research that's relevant to sports and exercise medicine in marginalised communities. And this award will also provide the recipients with opportunities to be mentored by fellow international sport and exercise medicine researchers through the BJSM Global Mentoring Program. Just to be clear, that marginalised communities include, but are not limited to, low and middle income countries, people who are Black, Indigenous or persons of colour, women, youth, people with disabilities, people from the LGBTQI+ community, those in conflict zones, and migrant, refugee and internally displaced communities. And for the purposes of the grant, marginalised communities includes both the participants, where the research is being done, but also the researchers themselves. So there are key elements of the grant that you need to include. So what I'd like to do now is step through each of these one by one to give you some examples of how you can make these elements as good as they can possibly be. So firstly, if we look at the title of the study, you need to make the title catchy, but also an accurate reflection of your project. So here's an example of a good title. So reducing the burden of hip pain in women. So that's the catchy part of the title. A pilot randomized controlled trial comparing cortisone versus placebo on hip-related quality of life in women with hip dysplasia. And here the PICO format can be helpful to make sure that the title's really clear. So for the PICO format, the P is the participants, the I is the intervention if you're using an intervention, the C is the comparator if you have a comparator intervention, and O is the outcome. So then we come to the background and rationale of the study, and this should be around about 1/2 to 3/4 of a page in your application. And in this section, you need to describe why the study is important. So describe the problem and why it needs to be addressed. You also need to describe why this study is novel. So a classic example is that a similar study might have been done, but not in your population. So you might be wanting to do an ACL injury prevention study in a group from a marginalised community. And so ACL interventions, injury prevention studies have been done perhaps in high income countries, but not so much in low or middle income countries. And then you also need to make sure that the background and the rationale for the study is really well referenced and justifies your study design. So it needs to link, the background really needs to speak to the aims of your study, which is what we're going to talk about next. So the objectives or the aims of the study and the hypothesis should be around 3 to 4 lines each. So it's very important that the objective is clear and it matches the title of the study, and also the background speaks to the objectives. So here's an example of an objective of the study. So thinking about that title that we talked about before, our objectives might look something like this. So our primary aim is to compare the effectiveness of cortisone versus placebo on hip-related quality of life at 3 months in Australian women who are aged 18 to 40 years with hip dysplasia. And our secondary aims are to explore the effects of cortisone on hip muscle strength and hip cartilage quality. So when we look at this objective, there are elements that it already includes, which I'll go through shortly, but our hypothesis then needs to match the objectives and also have a direction. So here, for this one, we hypothesize that cortisone will provide a greater clinical benefit on hip-related quality of life compared to placebo in Australian women aged 18 to 40 years with hip dysplasia. So the direction is greater. We're saying that we're thinking one is going to be better than the other. So if we look at these, what we can see here is we've used the PICO format again that we talked about previously. So we've shown that this is an effectiveness study. We've talked about the interventions that we're going to include, which are cortisone versus placebo, both the intervention and control. We've mentioned our outcome here. So our outcome is hip-related quality of life, and we've been very specific at which time point we're going to be following this up. We've mentioned our population, very clearly Australian women aged 18 to 40 years with hip dysplasia. And then we've also described any secondary or exploratory aims of the study. So it's really important that your objective and aims are this clear and this specific and have this level of detail. So then we come to the study design and the methodology, and this should be around about 3/4 to 1 page, and you need to have a lot of detail in this section. So I'm just going to now go through, this is quite a detailed slide, what this should look like. So the first thing that you need to do is to describe the study, including the type of study, the guideline that you will use, whether or not ethical consent will be obtained as well. So here's an example here. We will conduct a cross-sectional study in accordance with the stroke statement. We will gain ethical approval from the La Trobe University Human Research Ethical Committee, and all participants will provide informed consent. So then you next need to describe your participants. So here we say that an example might be we are going to recruit a total of 48 people with hip osteoarthritis and 48 matched healthy controls. So you need to describe it, but then you also need to list all of the inclusion criteria and exclusion criteria as well for your participants. So these sections you should be including in every grant application. Then you need to describe how you're going to recruit participants. So here's an example. Participants for the osteoarthritis group will be recruited via clinical networks, which includes general practitioners, physiotherapists, sports physicians, and orthopaedic surgeon clinics. You then need to describe in detail the study procedure, so how you will conduct the study, including how and where and who will collect the data. If yours is an intervention study, you need to describe in detail any interventions that you're going to use, including control groups, and importantly, how adherence to the interventions will be measured. Then you need to have a heading that describes the outcomes. So you need to describe any demographic variables that you collect, what your primary outcome measure is, and for the primary outcome measure, it's important that you have detail about the accuracy of this measure and its appropriateness for this specific population. And then any secondary and exploratory outcome measures. You need to justify and describe the sample size that you're going to use. So you might have a formal sample size calculation for your study, or it might be that you are going to use a standard number for the study design that you can justify. So for example, a qualitative study, you might recruit up to 15 to 20 participants until data saturation is obtained. For a reliability study, you might include 30 or 50 participants, but if you don't do a formal sample size calculation, you then need to justify why you've chosen the number of participants that you've chosen. And then you need to describe in detail the statistical analysis that you're going to do. So that includes a detail of the software that you're going to use, any statistical tests that you will use that can answer the aim of the study, particularly the primary aim, any covariates that you will adjust the results for, so things like age or sex or other covariates, what level of statistical significance that you will use. So for example, P will be less than 0.05. And how the data is going to be presented. So for example, we will present mean differences between the groups with 95% confidence intervals. Then the significance and clinical research or policy impact needs to be around about half a page. So in this section, you need to remind the reader of the novelty of your question and the importance of this project to the SEM community and the marginalised group concerned. Also remember to include how this funding will have a significant impact on your career as a researcher. So not just the research findings, but your development as a researcher. And then describe if the impact is on a clinical practice, on future research, on policy, or on a combination of these things. Now, the timeline is really important because it shows us that your grant is going to be feasible. So this should be around about a quarter of a page, or you can use a table, which I'll show you on the next slide. And in this one, you need to make it really clear that you've considered all of the things that you will need to do and how long it will take. What this shows us is the investment, which is the provision of the grant money, is likely to lead to a successful outcome. So it shows that the grant is feasible. So this is an example here of a timeline. Now, there's a lot of detail here, but what you can see we've done here for this particular study is we've listed what the thing we're going to do is, and then we've broken the year down into months, and then we've shaded what are the months that we're going to be doing the work, and which is in the blue, and then the green is the month that we expect to finish the work. So I'd really encourage you to do a timeline like this that breaks the study down into elements and then shows the months at which you'll do it so that the reviewer can look at this and go, I can see that this study is very feasible and likely to be successful. The budget is really important too. So it's really important that you make it really, really clear what the money will be spent on and how. So you can use about 4 to 8 lines, or you can use a table to do this. So we can see here for this grant, we had a table where we gave a breakdown on what all of the money was going to be spent on. So a description of how the money is going to be spent, and then a breakdown of which portion of the funds we're going to be spending on this, so that the reviewer again can see very clearly that you've thought through how you're going to spend each aspect of the funding. And then lastly, the qualifications of the research team or applicant is important. So it's important that you list your formal qualifications, but also list your skills that match this project, and do the same for all of the investigators. To describe any mentoring and support that you're going to get from more experienced researchers, which might include someone from the Global Mentoring Program. And then make sure you describe which marginalised group you as a research team belong to. Now, sometimes you might prefer not to do this, and that's okay, but you just need to state that in your application. So I just thought to finish off, what I would do is I would show you the criteria that we use to score your grant against, and which sections we'll be looking for these things, so that you can see how we're going to score it. So when we score these grants, we give each of these 10 criteria 10 points each, and then your final score is out of 100. So you need to address all of the elements, and you can see where we're going to get these scores from. So, for example, the first criteria is the qualifications of the principal investigator. So we will go to your qualification section to look for this. Secondly, when we're looking at the novelty of the research in general, but in the equity and deserving group, we'll go to the title and the background and the significance to get this information. For the impact of the project on the equity deserving group, we'll find that in the title and the background and the significance. For the impact and clinical significance to sport and exercise medicine in general, we will find that in the title and the background and the significance. The appropriateness of the study design and experimental approach to address the research question, we're going to look for that in the objectives and also in the methods section. The methodological rigour of the project we will get from the objectives and the methods section. The contribution of the project to BJSM's EDI principles, we will get that from the whole grant really, but particularly from the methods and the significance and the qualification sections. The feasibility of the grant being done within the grant period, we will get that from the methods and the timeline and the budget. We'll look at all of those elements. The feasibility of the project with the grant resources, including appropriateness of the budget, we will look at the methods and the timeline and the budget. So just remember, in your budget, it's okay to list in-kind support. So that might be elements of the project where you've got money from elsewhere to pay for it. So it's okay to list that as well, because it helps us see the feasibility of the overall project. And finally, the overall presentation of the application is really, really important. So we will look at all sections for this, and that includes attention to detail and neatness. It doesn't necessarily include English language, because we recognise that if someone's not a native English speaker, that may be more challenging, but we will still look at the overall presentation for neatness and things. So what I hope is that this has given you all a really good understanding, and now Dr. Mukumbuzi and I are really happy to answer any questions that you have about this presentation or the grant scheme. So thanks very much, and we'll look forward to chatting.